This is the Hervoy Moritz Show on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
All right. Howdy. Welcome to the show here on TNT Radio.live. Today's News Talk, all about the truth, uncensored, unfiltered. We see the canceling and deplatforming picking up pace all around us, but not here. One of the last outposts of free speech. Our guest today is Cynthia Chung, a lecturer, writer, and co-founder and editor of the Rising Tide Foundation, based in Montreal, I believe. You can also find her writings at cynthiachung.substack.com, Through a Glass Darkly. She also writes for Strategic Culture and maybe even in some other places. She's all over the place. Thank you for joining me on TNT for the first time, Cynthia.
Yeah, thank you. And congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. We spoke for the first time on my Geopolitics and Empire podcast, and that was well received, except for the one or two trolls. But that's usual that leave nasty comments. But in general, it was well received. And I heard they renamed. I don't know how to pronounce it. Poutine, the Canadian potato cheese dish, because of Vladimir Putin. Do people eat a lot of that up there north in Canada? And what's going on with the renaming of that?
I didn't hear about that, but that doesn't surprise me. But I did hear that it's so lame in Canada in terms of us trying to get some sort of recognition that they were saying that we need to have emoticons with like poutine and and a certain type of Quebec patriotic symbols in order to somehow, I guess, boost the economy. It's becoming a weird world that we're living in, but yeah. It doesn't surprise me. I don't actually know, like nobody here in Quebec, I live in Quebec, really cares about poutine that much. So it's not like a big thing. It's just like a gimmick.
Yeah, I mean,
it's okay, but
you got to have some cultural thing. And I spent a month in Quebec some years ago, and I remember, you have to try it because it's the local thing. Well, there's a lot to talk about. You write a lot about, many things. We talked previously about, scientific dictatorship, technocracy, the Great Reset. You've recently been writing on Ukraine and the Nazi aspect. And I've only recently been getting into that. I've spoken recently. I had Ryan Christian of Last American Vagabond on the program to talk about that for the first time. And on Geopolitics and Empire, I recently interviewed Thierry Meyssan, the French intellectual from VoltaireNet. And we got, that hasn't been posted yet, but we got into the Nazis in Ukraine. And so, what topic would you like to broach first? You want to get into that or what?
I was going to actually let you decide because, you had like 6 different topics as like a possibility. And I mean, you're the host. You decide what you think is most fitting.
Well, let's start with that then, because as I said, I've only recently been getting into it. And I mean, from what I can tell, the mainstream media, there's like a blackout of this, this is a big piece to the puzzle, I think. And you go into the back history all the way back to World War II in your article, looking at the Ukrainian nationalist movement, and you basically conclude that it's bought and paid for by the CIA, which is also what Ryan Christian was saying, and Thierry Meyssan as well. And so, maybe we can start there, because this is, I think this is a key component of what's actually going on in this war in Ukraine right now. So, could you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure, no problem. One thing, I'll start in the 20th century, but one thing people should keep in mind with the history of Ukraine is that it never was an independent region, and it never existed as the region that we know of Ukraine consistently throughout history. So people will need to know, in order to understand what I'm going to go through, that the Kievan Rus was this federation that existed. I believe it was in what century was it? It was in the late 9th century. And this area took up much of Eastern Europe and the northern aspects and a little bit of what is Russia today. And this was there was a golden age of Kievan Rus, and Ukraine forms part of this. It also overlaps with Belarus, Russia, and other countries. But it's very much the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and the Russians who look at Kievan Rus as their cultural heritage. And Kievan Rus fell in the mid 1200s from the Mongol invasion, which later on turned into a Turkish controlled region. But Kievan Rus continued to exist in three different branches, and it was run by the Rurik dynasty. So the Rurik dynasty itself also split up into three branches, which one was the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, which is today Ukraine and Belarus for the most part, the Novgorod Republic, which today is part of Finland and Russia, and the Vladimir Suzdal, which is considered the cradle of the great Russian language and nationality. It became the Grand Duchy of Moscow. So there was an issue that started to happen, and I don't know the full details on this, but there's there was a Ukrainian independence movement that was going through during the time of basically after World War I, when you had a whole bunch of empires that no longer existed, and there was vying for independence for several countries. There was a pre-nationalist movement to the Ukrainian nationalist movement. And there were historians that were coming out that, and this is the earliest that I saw, where they were starting to make claims that it was the Ukrainian people who were the only true bloodline to the Rurik dynasty. And that started to cause, obviously, problems because they didn't consider the Belarusians or the Russians true inheritors of this golden age, which is very much romanticized. I mean, it was a great period as well for the people during this time where they had independence for a very several centuries. And that's the thing, is that because after Kievan Rus broke down, they became Turkish Khanates, all three. So they never had full independence. And then, they got, the Ukrainians got sucked into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and so forth. And they never had independence until really 1991, which that's even arguably, true independence because they were beholden to the IMF at that point. But so you started to have some, at the time in 1929, which we're going to focus on, which is the Organization of the Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN. This is really the foundation for the Nazi ideology that we have today in Ukraine. And that was started in East Galicia, which was at the time Poland. So they had gone through centuries of going between either Polish rule or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the Polish seemed to have been very unkind. And so this organization was calling for an independent, but also ethnically homogenous Ukraine. And their understanding of independence was linked to this return to a pure ethnicity of Ukrainian blood. And they believed that the reason why Ukraine had been subjugated all of these centuries and never regained the glory days of the Kievan Rus was because they lacked that pure ethnicity. And that's why, I realized, the trident symbol, which you see so often, it's, it's an official symbol of Ukraine. It's part of their coat of arms, which was brought in 1991. The trident symbol is a symbol of Vladimir Volodymyr the Great from the Kievan Rus period. And so it's just a kind of romanticized reference point to they want to return to those days. And that's why a lot of these neo-Nazi groupings in Ukraine today, they have the trident symbol on almost everything. in terms of their flags and their emblems and so forth, because it's in reference to that. So in 1929, when the OUN is formed, I'm not going to probably go into as much detail as I have in my article, but you can find it on my Substack. Basically, they assassinate, the Polish Interior Minister, Bronislaw Periaki in 1934. There's a trial in 1936, and among the OUN members who are convicted and imprisoned are Stefan Bandera and Mykola Lebed. And, the OUN has two factions, the OUNM and the OUNB eventually that form. And the OUNB is the Stefan Bandera, Mykola Lebed faction. They're the younger people who are, you could say, are a little bit more impulsive, and they tend to be also more violent. So Stefan Bandera and Mykola Lebed were in prison until the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, and that's when they were able to escape. And so the OUN had a lot of support from what is now Western Ukraine, but at the time was part of Poland, Eastern Galicia. The Ukrainians had a lot of support for OUN against the Polish persecution. And so they had about 20,000 active members. There were many more sympathizers. And it kind of radicalized that population. And you see, a large part of what I rely on for this particular article was in 1998, there was a massive declassification of a whole bunch of Nazi records from the CIA, OSS, Army intelligence, and so forth. And there is documentation of how when the Germans, came in, the Ukrainians, not just the OUN members, like Ukrainians in general were, participated in pogroms of the Jews and also the Polish people. And so it really was already quite extreme of a problem. And if you look at the OUNB flag, it's the blood and soil flag, which is in reference to the Nazis, were the ones who first coined that phrase. And it's a little bit ironic because it was like the Ukrainians, even though they're Slavic people, it seems like they think that they're different from other Slavic people, because part of the blood and soil reference was to the general plan Ost of Hitler, which was to enslave all of the Slavic and Baltic people. But the Ukrainians in Galicia, for some reason, thought that, I guess, maybe they weren't aware of it, I have no idea, that they were maybe not going to be beholden to that. And so in, when was it? Basically at, June 30th, 1941, after they're helping the Nazis, do their thing, Bandera proclaims an independent Ukrainian state in the name of Bandera, right? Because Bandera always wanted to be a dictator of Ukraine. This whole idea of him being just like a liberator of the people is not accurate. But he also proclaimed that Ukraine would be an independent state under his name, but pledged loyalty to Hitler. So even though Bandera was imprisoned by the Germans, as soon as he did this, a bunch of them were arrested and some of them were killed outright by the Gestapo, approximately 1,500 of the OUN people, because the Germans had no intention of having a semi-independent, Ukraine even. Stefan Bandera and his closest deputy, Yaroslav Stetsko, are in the Sachsenhausen, sorry for my pronunciation, concentration camp for most of the war. They would be freed in 1944 by the Germans. And so a lot of people say Bandera never collaborated with the Nazis, but he did. It was for a short period because he was arrested, but he pledged loyalty to Hitler and everything. He had no problem working with the Nazis to obtain, his dictatorship over that section of Ukraine. So Mykola Lebed, he's able to slip away from the German police, and he becomes the new leader of the OUNB. And the Germans, this is when they send out the notorious wanted poster of Lebed, which he carried for the rest of his life around with him as proof that he never worked with the Nazis, because he had this wanted poster, which we're going to see. It's complicated, this history, because it's like, when you're talking about gangsters as well, there's a lot of like infighting, there's a lot of crossfighting, but then at times there's collaboration, sometimes there's not. But at the end of the day, it was really the Polish people, the Jewish people, and any Ukrainian who didn't agree with the ideology of the OUN, which we see happening in Ukraine today as well. Those people were also attacked. And then you also had, OUN members infighting the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which was like the paramilitary unit from OUN. There were different leaders as well. They say that Lebed was able to take control over UPA by basically killing a whole bunch of the previous leaders before him. So this whole idea that this is a movement of the people, and the people were united for freedom and independence is not accurate. Again, it's a lot to go through, but in terms of referring to the declassified material, it's very clear that the Nazis actually, because they were starting to lose the war, they were looking increasingly at Lebed's rule, which was a very brutal rule, not only for the OUN members that he had no problem killing, but that was when the largest amount of ethnic cleansing occurred, was when Lebed was the leader of the OUN. And, there was really horrible torture and mutilation as well that was on par with the horror stories you hear from Nazi Germany and Japan's Unit 731. So, really not necessary types of sadistic. I mean, the Americans actually had in their report on Lebed that he is a well-known sadist and collaborator of the Germans. But anyway, the book that I referenced a lot to with the declassified material, it's called U.S. Intelligence and the Nazis. And in one section of the book, they write, though the UPA, which again is the Ukrainian Insurgent Army paramilitary unit off of OUN, though UPA propaganda emphasized that organization's independence from the Germans, the UPA also ordered some young Ukrainians to volunteer for the Ukrainian SS division, and the rest to fight by guerrilla methods. Lebed still hoped for recognition from the Germans, end quote. And the Ukrainian SS division, so directly working for the Nazis, that existed from April 1943 to April 1945. The Germans only surrendered May 7th. So for a huge chunk of the war, and the Ukrainian SS division had OUN members coming in and out of that. So there was not like a separation between the two. And as the Nazis were losing the war, they increasingly found that the OUN was necessary. And Lebed knew that in order for him to have a stronghold for the area he wanted for independence, he would need the German support in order to resist the Russian support. Whereas the Germans, I'm sure, regarded the Ukrainians as just a human shield. And one last note is that in September 1944, again, according to these declassified material, German army officers in northern Ukraine told their superiors in foreign armies east that the UPA was, quote, natural ally of Germany, end quote, and, quote, a valuable aid for the German high command. This is in September 1944. end quote. And Himmler himself authorized intensified contacts with the UPA. So yeah, that was a lot of information, and I can go into the CIA part, but I don't know if you have a few things to say.
Yeah, we just, what you mentioned earlier, I thought it's interesting where, they're Slavs, you say Ukrainians, and they adhere to this ideology, which, from my reading of history, according to the Nazis, Slavs were Untermensch, we were to be used, because I'm a Slav, Croatian, and we were to be used as slave labor and, disposed of at some point. We're disposable.
Yes.
And so, I get when someone, it's never really happened, but you see in social media with the wokeists who might refer to me as like, the whites are also targeted today with this wokeism. I'm like, well, wait a minute, I'm a Slav. Some say that the word slave came from Slav, which is not confirmed. I tried to find more, if that could be confirmed. I couldn't find that, but so yeah, there's that. And then I was also going to mention that I've seen this neo-Nazism seems to be growing today. I've seen reports on even like small groups in Mexico, or even as far as Mongolia. I've seen reports who have subscribed to this neo-Nazi ideology, and I'm thinking, well, I mean, the Nazis would definitely do away with the Slavs or the Mongolians or the Mexicans. And I'm like, how can you subscribe to this? And in my conversation with Thierry Mason, he was pointing out that 1/3 of the Ukrainian government or military forces are into this Nazi ideology, that the Azov battalion is only parts of that 1/3, and that's a lot, like 1/3, and that I listened to that Unheard. They did a great interview with a journalist who was on the ground in Ukraine speaking to these people, and that they have this ties back to some of your expertise, that this neo-Nazism today in Ukraine is esoteric. It's a cult. Well, I guess Nazism was always like that, but that they believe Hitler is, like a god. And so, and I'm also starting to see myself as a Croatian, we were, just like Ukraine was, Croatia participated in, for 3 years, from 1941 to 44, I believe, Croatia was a Croatian Nazi fascist regime, and they participated with Hitler. And then you have this Ustasha grouping. And today that's also growing as well. So you've got the situation in Ukraine, and there's people in Croatia. It's budding again, this Croatian Nazi ideology as well. And so, yeah, I see that going on. And you can see in the social media, I also see this growing neo-Nazism worldwide and anti-Semitism. Some of it, I think, has government involvement, like on the social media feeds, these people commenting, because I think, as you alluded to, well, some of the government is actually not, has this Nazi ideology, like, European governments, with Operation Paperclip, we took a lot of these Nazis into the U.S.
And Operation Gladio, too.
Yeah, and let's get into that after the break. And I was also going to mention that I also think some of this apparent neo-Nazism is actually government's, how would you say, false flag operations online, where they're trying to pin some of us as Nazis as ways to discredit. So I think some of it's genuine, and some of it is just this sorts of disinformation operations. And so let's get into Gladio and some other stuff after the break. No one go anywhere. You're listening to TNT Radio.
Trish Wood on TNT Radio.
I thought, well, that's kind of like the end of the war. And then there was another piece that I saw in, I believe it was the Jerusalem Post, which said that two sides are still talking at very high levels. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why am I having to look for that kind of information? Why isn't that top of mind during the newscasts, who are instead focusing on refugees and crying babies wrapped in Ukrainian flags waiting at the border? I mean, it would seem to me that those concessions by Zelensky might be a game changer.
Well, yes, but it's a game changer that doesn't favor the current geopolitical should we say, motivations and aims of the US at the moment.
Trish Wood on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
The journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. At Children International, we know that the journey to end poverty for good begins first with a child. It starts with their first checkup, lesson, opportunity, job. That journey takes commitment from people like you and me to end poverty for good. Learn more at children.org.
This is it. Your chance to come face to face with a Royal Marines Commando. They've set you a mission, so you will need to listen to the following instructions very carefully. Meet at the rendezvous. The Royal Marine Commandos will be there waiting for you. Locate them, talk to them, and learn about what it takes to become a Royal Marines Commando. To find out more details about this secret mission, call 0117 926 0233. Got that? 0117 926 0233. However, you should be aware, complete this mission and your future missions will be a lot more challenging. Royal Marine Commandos. 99.99% need not apply.
News more twisted than soap operas. And with worse actors.
Can't be serious.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
And we are back from the break. I'm your host, Hrvoje Morić on TNT Radio.live. We've been talking to Cynthia Chung of RisingTideFoundation.net. Do check out that website as well as her Substack, cynthiachung.substack.com. I haven't found you on Twitter. You're not on Twitter, are you, Cynthia?
No. No, I'm kind of checked out for a lot of things, social media wise.
Well, yeah, that way you have more time then to focus on your prolific writing. And so we've been talking about Nazis in Ukraine because the mainstream media isn't. And so let's get to then up to speed to today. You know, there's Operation Gladio. If people have, Daniel Ganser, the Swiss historian, is one of the top guys on that. In general, he's one of my top favorites in terms of deep politics, political science, and history. He's just amazing, and he explains things so well. He wrote one of the books. You also reference. I haven't read the book Richard Cottrell's Gladio, NATO's Dagger at the Heart to Europe. I haven't read that yet. I'm going to have to. But I also feel that NATO has, if I recall correctly, one of the early heads of NATO was a former Nazi, and just a lot of their operations, they carried out state terror, false flag attacks all throughout the Cold War against us. I'm a European, so against me, against my European, our European governments. And you talk about this guy, one of the founders, in a sense, grandmasters behind the strategy of attention, Gladio. And so could you talk about some of this stuff?
I just realized as you were talking, I'm like, how do you know this information? Because I thought you just knew I was going to write on Operation Gladio because I said that would be the next article. I didn't realize Strategic published it today. Sure, I will get I will get into that. I just wanted to add very quickly that the whole reason why there's this like popularization of the Nazis, I find in a whole bunch of places that are even, places that really shouldn't be, attracted to that sort of thing, like Mongolia, is that my view on extremism of any sort, including, ISIS type of extremism and so forth, is that it's directly tied to economics, and it's, how a people feel in terms of their future. Do they have a future? Do they have a prosperous future? Do they have freedom to determine that future? Or is it a feeling that you're completely submitted, beholden to, oppressed to something, and you're struggling to survive? And Ukraine, it used to be the breadbasket of Europe when it was under the USSR, which is a very inconvenient fact that is never obviously brought up. But when Ukraine became independent in 1991, the IMF really gutted the Ukrainian economy, and the GDP dropped like extremely, so that they've been in like a kind of economic depression situation from like right out of the gate basically. And this is their first time ever really being independent, because even when they were part of Kiev and Rus, it wasn't, a Ukraine state. They were part of something that was larger than themselves. So I think that it's not there. Another reason why these neo-Nazi groups started to form in Ukraine right at 1991 and the mid 90s is because the CIA, specifically under Alan Dulles, was directly responsible for this through the aerodynamic program, which Mykola Lebed was put in place for. And people can look at the paper I have on the subject. The Ukrainian nationalist movement post-World War II was bought and paid for by the CIA. But, at first it was supposed to be a guerrilla unit attack against the Soviet Union, but later on it turned into a cultural and a historical form of warfare. And it was through the Prologue Research and Publishing Association. So they were funneling information into Ukraine since 1956, actually 1953. And they were, spinning a type of historical, perspective that was promoting the OUN outlook for Ukrainian nationalism. And this also was in the literature. It was in their newspapers, their radio programming, everything. It was, it really continued this kind of extremism for several decades, so that by 1991, and then, they made the situation ripe economically by blowing out their economy. You're going to have recruitment for this sort of thing much more quickly. And the Ukrainians tend to just always blame the Russians for everything, even though, since 1991, your economy has not, everything that has happened to you has been because of the IMF, the whole EU deal too, that was supposed to be the reason why the 2014 revolution happened. That was, basically a deal that the Ukrainians were fighting and dying for, that was going to, benefit companies like Burisma Holdings. They were going to be paying, higher rates for their energy while their salaries remained the same. They didn't even realize what they were fighting for. And then, the most absurd thing is that Nuland is caught on this leaked call where they're going to be forming the Ukrainian government. It's like the Americans bought and paid for that revolution, and then they decide what the government is going to be formed afterwards. The Ukrainian people never got to decide anything for them, and they continue to blame the Russians. And now they're the poorest country in Europe. The situation is really bad for Ukrainians, and they just refuse to acknowledge that there's something else going on in terms of, why they're in the situation they're in. In terms of Operation Gladio, that basically during World War II, there were stay-behind guerrilla units that were set up by Churchill in the event that either the Germans would win, that they would want these stay-behind units, but it was also probably always with the thought that with the Soviets as well. And after World War II ended, they continued to expand these guerrilla warfare units that were stationed all throughout Europe. It was at first kind of called Churchill's Secret Army, and it was based off of the British Special Operations Executive. And eventually they started to adopt this into the NATO structure. And right away, they had the former Nazis, because after World War II, every Nazi that hadn't been put in prison was a former Nazi. They started to have these Nazis basically implemented in all levels, like military, police, surveillance, and government. And NATO was a part of this. And the justification was that they had to protect themselves against the Soviet communism. And, you know, it was expected. I think Churchill did believe that he really was afraid that the Soviets were going to invade Western Europe as soon as Hitler was defeated. But it never happened. And this is where it, you know, gets really messed up, because they end up using these secret armies that are beholden to NATO to start committing terrorist acts on the European citizens and removing democratically elected officials from European governments in order to, by committing these terrorist acts and blaming it on the communists, which is the red flag operations you were referring to, that this would then centralize more power to these right-wing governments that were pro NATO and, you know, ultimately pro-fascism. So this was largely hidden until around the early 1990s, when the Italian prime minister, because Italy has a lot of this going on in terms of Operation Gladio, and the Andreotti said in August 1990 he had to confess at a special commission inquiry that Operation Gladio had been existing for all these years, that there was a secret army, and that we had to keep it secret, or else then the Russians would know. And but it was disbanded in 1971, and this isn't just an issue for Italy anyway. It was, you know, for all countries in Europe. So you can't just blame me, kind of thing, and all this. But a lot more has come to light at this point, that so much. It's kind of like also what the FBI has been found guilty of, that almost every type of terrorist act that they were able to catch, you know, before it happened, or maybe even after, you had FBI agents who basically were there from the very beginning. It's kind of like they encouraged the idea, they helped fund the idea, equip the idea so that the idea could be executed. And so you'd have to ask yourself, well, would it have ever have happened if the FBI wasn't involved? Because it seemed like the FBI was involved with, you know, every level of the crime. Well, it's the same thing with Operation Gladio, that they were doing all of this.
Let me just add about the FBI. Years ago, for Geopolitics and Empire, I interviewed Trevor Aronson, who gave a TED talk, and he wrote a book. I think it's called Terror Factory. And he looked at the data, like the hardcore actual data from 9/11 until today, or whenever his book was published, maybe 5-6 years ago, from like 9/11 to 2012 or something like that, looking at all the domestic terror events. And just like you said, he factually found that every single, well, first of all, there were no real domestic terror events, but every so-called, you know, one that was caught by the FBI was actually led by FBI, either an FBI informant or undercover FBI.
I know.
So they were inventing it, and he presented the data to the FBI before he published his book, like to say, hey guys, like, am I wrong? And they didn't say anything. They didn't negate it. So this is like a fact. And even this latest shooting, you can't keep up with all this stuff in New York. Like, the guy was known, you know, to the FBI, so they just let it happen. And I would just add as well, people can, all of this stuff is documented. Like I said, Trevor Aronson's to Terror Factory or Gladio, you can go to the EU's own website. Like when I was giving courses on this,
really?
Because I mean, even still, when it's documented, students and teachers and administrators call you crazy conspiracy theorists. And I'm like, look, it's actually on that. You can go to the EU website, and I think it's like from 1990, they have this court case where the EU itself admits, like, Gladio was real, and they carried out, you know, NATO carried out state terrorism, basically. And so, anyways, this stuff's out
crazy.
there.
It's so crazy. And I want to mention really quickly too that Yves Guérin-Serac, which the French intelligence, like, holy cow, you know, when I did research for this paper, I always had like the movie idea of intelligence that is really, British, American, and Russian intelligence, and the French intelligence was a joke. No, French intelligence is not a joke at all. And Yves Guérin-Sérac, who was also, he was everywhere, but he was also working with certain forms of French intelligence. There are like 4 groupings of French intelligence, so it's quite complicated. But he's the mastermind of the Black Ops operation for Operation Gladio, and he basically, organized through Agenter Press these training grounds to train, gangsters, but other types of people that they were thinking would fit the bill. And this includes the Green Berets too. Were also involved in these training to train people in these training centers, but they were involved basically in these secret armies type activities. And in he kind of wrote a Gladio manual for how to be a good terrorist, titled Our Political Activity. And I just want to read something, because I think that this is highly relevant for how we should look at some of the things going on today. He says, "Our belief is that the first phase of political activity ought to be to create the conditions favoring the installation of chaos in all of the regime's structures. In our view, the first move we should make is to destroy the structure of the democratic state under the cover of communist and pro-Soviet activities. Moreover, we have people who have infiltrated these groups." And he continues, "Two forms of terrorism can provoke such a situation of a breakdown of the democratic state: blind terrorism, which is committing massacres indiscriminately, which cause a large number of victims, and selective terrorism, which are basically assassination of individuals." He goes on to say, to write, "This destruction of the state must be carried out under the cover of communist activities. After that, we must intervene at the heart of the military, the juridical power, and the church in order to influence popular opinion," because the Vatican Church is also very much involved in Operation Gladio. He goes on to write, "We need to suggest a solution, clearly demonstrate the weakness of the present legal apparatus. Popular opinion must be polarized in such a way that we are being presented as the only instrument capable of saving the nation."
Yeah, it's documented. It's like, I was just quickly checking up the reference, and I think some of it, I think Ganser cites it in his book from what I was seeing. And so this is documented. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. Even Richard Cottrell too. So, it explains a lot of, the more you start to study something like Operation Gladio, which is incredibly complex, and this assassination network of secret armies that also were working with the official intelligence agencies of not just European countries, but Britain and the United States, were involved with a whole bunch of assassinations, including Italy's ex-Prime Minister Aldo Moro. And that was Andreotti was the one who was Prime Minister of Italy after the assassination of Aldo Moro. Sweden's Prime Minister Olof Palme, Turkey's Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, and Kennedy is also connected to this assassination network that was ultimately run by NATO. And there were several attempts on the life of President de Gaulle and also Pope John Paul II. Now, I'm not an expert on the whole Vatican thing. I had to kind of brush over that very quickly in Richard Cottrell's book, but Richard Cottrell goes through that in detail, and his book is titled Gladio, NATO's Dagger at the Heart of Europe, which is very detailed, and he goes through a lot of court cases as well. So again, there is documentation of a lot of this material. It's not just hypothetical.
Yeah, I would add as well, you mentioned de Gaulle, and that's something that I discussed, that Thierry Mason brought up with my forthcoming interview with him. I think he said something like there were 40 attempts on de Gaulle. And I look up to people like Charles de Gaulle, and you mentioned Kennedy. I recently I found this quote from Charles de Gaulle that I love, and I posted it on social media with an image of Charles de Gaulle and Kennedy walking out of a building together. And de Gaulle says, "Let us be firm, pure, and faithful. At the end of our sorrow, there is the greatest glory of the world, that of the men who did not give in." And we saw Kennedy did not
that's
give
a
in.
great quote.
And he paid with his life. We saw de Gaulle did not give in. He persevered. He was against NATO. He was, I think he also, like, going off on a tangent, he wanted the France's gold, when the Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, or I think right before that. Charles de Gaulle was in many ways, I think he was doing a lot of good things. And so, we've got a few minutes left. I don't know where you'd like to end with the Nazis, or to get any other things to say.
Well, I would say, I think we've talked maybe enough about Nazis, but I would say that there's, I think, a lot of existentialism that's going on right now. People feel really overloaded. They're feeling very paranoid and distrustful of, like, how can you trust anything in terms of the narrative that's going on for right now. And of course, one of the ways to resolve this is to study history. And it's not to say that history is going to tell you all of the truths either, but there are ways to do it where you can get a much better idea. But I would just make the point that the Ukrainian situation was an entirely predictable and provoked situation. From my standpoint, I think that it was deliberately provoked. And they crossed that clear red line that Russia put forward because they wanted to create another Iron Curtain, because Russia and China are going to be launching a new economic system, but so is the West, right? Like we're in a transition point for what will be the new order. World order. It doesn't have to be an ominous term, right? Like we do need order in the world, but what is going to be the economic system that's going to be taking over? And economics is the key here, in according to how I'm looking at things. And I think that they pushed that red line for the Ukrainian situation to get to where it is. And you can see the Americans' hands are all over the extremism that has been, fomented in Ukraine. Sure, it naturally arose, but they have done everything to fuel that fire to the max. And, they're training, they're funding, they're doing everything they can do to make it as bad as possible. They push that red line so that it would make it almost impossible for, countries like France and Germany to have economic partnerships with Russia and China, because if you are faced with the decision to either, do a slow bleed on yourself economically, which has been what Europe has been facing for a while now, but there's only so much blood left, versus, getting onto a system that looks like it can actually offer growth and prosperity, you're obviously going to choose the latter. But now with the Ukrainian war situation, it's made that almost impossible unless, there was some way of organizing these countries, which it's not looking good for Europe. It's actually a really bad situation for Europeans, all Europeans, not just Ukrainians or people in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, as you say, the strategy of tension it's used to manipulate the EU states. A lot of people don't know that more than 50% of the funding to create the EU came from the CIA and the State Department. That's documented. People have written about that. And so in a way, EU is an American globalist creation, and it's a vassal state. And Thierry Mason told me that this Ukraine conflict, his perspective is that it's all about the U.S. keeping the EU under its wing, and I guess weakening it, like destroying the EU in many ways. He says what's coming in the EU, the energy situation, there's going to be no energy. It's going to be so expensive. Just Europe is going to become impoverished. And he said also that he thinks that in terms of the world order, like we're going to be in two blocks that won't be talking to each other. And the West is just going to be like a declining block, like a smaller and smaller block as the Eurasian or multipolar system grows. And I also wanted to, I thought it was a great point you brought up about the poverty situation and how that pushes people to extremism. And I think you totally also nailed that, because in Mexico as well, we see over the past number of years, as the economy got better or got worse, when it got worse, you saw more Mexican people recruiting with the narcos and the cartels. That's another form of terrorism or extremism. And so whether it's the neo-Nazis or the cartels, when the situation is bad, or even in Croatia today, like the economic situation is horrible, so you see an increase in Ustaša Croatian Nazism. And I haven't even had time to. It was also what you brought up about this alternative system, the Cradle. Pepe Escobar wrote an article, a bombshell exclusive interview with Sergei Glaziev, the Russian economist. Ooh. I haven't even had time to read it. The summary is that they talk about the world's new monetary system, underpinned by digital currency, will be backed by a basket of new foreign currencies and natural resources, and it will liberate the global South from both Western debts and IMF-induced austerity. And I think they discussed that this new system will allow the multipolar world, global South, to default on their Western debt. So I'm gonna have to read this later tonight if people haven't. Maybe that Pepe was just nuked off of Twitter. It's just incredible, and we just got.
He doesn't need Twitter anyway. And I'm really looking forward to this interview you did with Thierry Masson, because I have so much respect for his everything that he's been. Very impressive history that he's lived.
Yeah, I've been reading his stuff for years, and I'm like looking like no one's interviewed him in English, because I mean he speaks like a number of languages, but
he's like one of those people. After he wrote about the 9/11 thing, he became like he was not a respected journalist at that point.
But in ways, he's like, I think he has some like a cult following. He's important. I think he worked in the Libyan government, he told me, and then he was in Syria hiding. He said in the interview he suffered physical attacks to him or his Voltaire network people. And his book was in French, best-selling, The Big Lie in 9/11. And I was looking around, like he said he hasn't spoken English in a year. And I'm like... you'll do all right. And his English, that's, how people always say that, where English isn't their first language. Anyways, we got just, I think, like 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts? I did want to ask you about, get your thoughts. I guess we'll have to wait another time on an update on where you see Technocracy and Great Reset going. But, less than 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts? And again, best places to find you.
My Substack, Cynthia Chung Substack, is the best place, I would say, or Strategic Culture Foundation. Rising Tide is more of historical and cultural stuff. And I would just leave people with, I think that Sergei Glaziev is the person to be looking at right now. And if you want to put pressure to have a future wherever you find yourself in the world, I think that what Sergei Glaziev is leading right now is super promising. Even if me living in Canada, I might not be directly, receiving the fruits of this in my lifetime. Who knows? But it's so exciting for what it's offering most of the world, and I'm so happy for this. I really do hope that nothing insane happens to sabotage it. But I do think that Sergei Glaziev's approach is the right approach.
All right. Yes, and there's the music. Everyone, do check out Cynthia Chung's websites. If people don't know, she's the better half of Matthew Ehret, he's a frequent guest now on TNT. He was on my show. He was on Jesse Zalwell's show. And so, you guys are doing great work. Thank you for being on TNT. We're going to take a news break. Stick around for hour 2.